They call it the cradle of Western civilization, ancient Greece, land of philosophers, poets, and marble gods. A society that birthed democracy, theater, logic, but beneath the sculpted beauty and celebrated ideals was a truth carved in silence, a truth of ownership, of flesh, a truth rarely told. Tonight, we descend into that silence. This is the story of a boy born not of nobility, not of glory, but of skin. A boy whose life was not his own. A concubinist, a pleasure boy in a world where desire was art, and love was control. If you crave the dark side of history, the voices erased, the pain polished into myth, you're in the right place. Subscribe now to Dark Hours Arc, because the truth is always darker than the legend. The boy's name is forgotten. History didn't preserve it. Perhaps it was changed the moment he was sold. Or perhaps he was never given one at all. Just a pet name, a whisper, a possession. He was taken from Thrace, or maybe Illyria borderlands, where wars and raids fed the slave markets of Athens and Corinth. His family, dead, or sold, or left behind. All that mattered was his appearance. Light skin, soft features, no scars, no strength. He was delicate, the way Greek men liked their concubines, not yet hardened by manhood, not yet ruined by time. He was no older than when they stripped him, they weren't checking for wounds. They were checking for purity, for beauty, for softness. And when they bought him, it wasn't to till fields or carry goods. It was for something far more intimate, more permanent. He was to be trained in silence, in stillness, in pleasure. In Athens, his new master was an Orestes, a citizen man of power, wealth, and polish. A philosopher perhaps, or a politician, or a poet they often were. And a boy, now Apes, the beloved. The capt was placed not in a stable or a dormitory, but in the endron, the male quarters, close to the wine, the music, the flesh. He slept at the foot of his master's bed. He was bathed not in the public fountains, but in perfumed oils. His skin was scrubbed, waxed, smoothed. His hair was styled into curls. Kohl was applied to his eyes, and, above all, he was trained not to speak, unless spoken to. His job was to smile, to pour wine, to dance, if requested, to submit, always. There were others like him. Dozens. Hundreds, even. Some bought. Some born into slavery. Some born free, then betrayed. In public, they were silent shadows. In private, they were the warmth in the room, the indulgence, and yet no one ever asked what they felt, what they feared, what they remembered of their own names, because they weren't boys anymore. They were decorations, flesh wrapped in silence. The nights were worst. He was summoned without warning, sometimes gently, sometimes not. He learned quickly what pleased. He learned even faster what didn't. He cried the first few times, quietly, into the bedding. But that stopped eventually. Tears brought questions. Questions brought punishment, or worse, retraining. There were places in Athens, Corinth, even Delphi, houses run by Hetairai and eunuchs, where broken boys were corrected, where whips taught obedience, where pain was called discipline. The boy didn't want to be so he learned how to freeze his face, how to hold his breath, how to leave his body behind. His voice became soft, his movements slower, his eyes distant. Some called him beautiful, others called him fortunate, to be in a rich house, to sleep on cushions, to eat figs, but no one asked him what he wanted, because he didn't matter. Not in the agora, not in the symposium, not even in the bedroom. At the feasts, he sat behind his master, pouring wine into shallow cups, as the men debated poetry and politics. They called him names, not insults, but pet names. Glyces, sweet one. Perdica, little love. Ogalma, living statue. Sometimes they tugged at him, pulled him close, passed him from lap to lap. His master allowed it. It was a mark of status to have a beautiful concubine, and to share him, briefly, with others of the same rank. Never too long, never overnight. Just enough to display possession, control, elegance. He hated the taste of wine, hated the smell of their breath, hated how they forgot his eyes were real. But he smiled, always smiled. It was safer that way. He wasn't allowed to grow, not just metaphorically. Literally, his diet was controlled, exercise limited, his hair kept long, his voice high. Some boys were even castrated, especially in Rome, a practice creeping into Greek provinces, as the empire grew, their voices preserved, their beauty eternal. He feared it every time he felt feverish. Every time a physician came, every time his master touched his hip and muttered about keeping him. But they never did it, not to him. Maybe it was mercy, maybe laziness, or maybe he just wasn't worth the cost. He was 17 when things changed. Not suddenly, not with a scream or a door slamming, but slowly, like rot beneath marble. His limbs began to stretch, his jaw sharpened, his voice deepened. No matter how tightly he was bound, how lightly he was fed, nature refused to wait. He was becoming a man, and that was the one thing he could never be. His master looked at him differently now, less tender, less possessive, sometimes with disgust. The house grew colder. New boys arrived, lighter, younger, softer. He was made to train them, to show them how to sit, how to smile, how to bathe without shame. It should have been a moment of pride, an elevation. But it was something else entirely. It was the beginning of replacement. He was no longer art. He was instruction, a breathing manual, a fading ornament preparing his own succession. At night, he was summoned less often. Then, not at all. He was moved from the master's chamber to a smaller room near the kitchens, his cushions replaced with rougher linen, his oils with stale soap. He still dressed finely, still attended symposiums, but now as a servant, not a jewel. He was watched, but not desired. He poured wine with his head bowed, not lifted, and when his hand trembled one evening and he spilled wine on a guest's robe, the silence in the room was sharp. His master stared at him for a long time, as if trying to remember why he ever wanted him in the first place. The next morning, he was whipped, quietly, privately. No blood, just bruises, punishment fit for a servant, not a pet. He understood then. He was becoming excess. He began to remember his own name, not the one given in the house, not the nickname whispered in the master's bed, but the one his mother used. Years ago, in a tongue no one here spoke, or a lie, but he clung to it. He began to remember other things too. The smell of smoke from his village, the face of his sister, the ache of being human. They were fragments, ghosts, but they were his. And yet, every time he spoke out of turn, looked someone in the eye, or moved too slowly, the memory was punished, beaten out of him, corrected. So, he stayed quiet, not because he was obedient, but because it was the only way to keep those memories safe. One day a guest came to the house, a magistrate from Sparta, tall and rough, with a voice like gravel and a scar down one side of his lip. He saw the boy, now a young man, carrying a bowl of olives, and paused. They spoke briefly. The magistrate had no interest in delicate wine boys. He wanted someone older, quieter, someone who knew how to disappear into walls. The transaction was silent, and the next morning, the boy was given a small sack of clothes, a single coin, and no farewell. He was sold again, but this time, not for beauty, not for pleasure, for utility. Sparta was not like Athens. There were no symposia, no flute girls, no dancing. Life was cold, sharp, functional. He was no longer dressed in linen, but in coarse wool. His hands were not adorned with rings, but raw from scrubbing. He was placed in the home of a widowed woman, an aristocrat whose sons had died in war. She rarely spoke. He rarely slept. He became a shadow again, not the glittering kind, but the kind that moved behind things, went unnoticed. But the bruises didn't stop. When he broke a cup, she struck him with a cane. When he was too slow bringing water, she screamed. She missed her sons, and he was not them. And some nights, she touched him anyway. Not out of desire, not like before, but out of grief. Out of madness he let her, because what else was he? Years passed. He grew tall, thinner. The softness left his face, and in its place, a hollowness settled. Not of starvation, but of memory. People stopped noticing him. He became part of the architecture, like stone, like smoke, but deep inside, something remained. Something like hunger. Not for food, for meaning. Sometimes, he passed other slaves in the market, young boys with perfect skin and empty eyes. He looked at them the way his master once looked at him, not with desire, with pity, because he knew how it ended. He knew what waited after the oils and pearls. Nothing. One winter, the woman he served died. Fever, quick and silent. And so he was sold once more, not as a pleasure slave, not as a house servant, but as labor, a body for rent, to carry stones, to dig. He could no longer read, could barely write. His joints ached, his skin burned in the sun. But he was alive, and that was more than he ever expected. At night, he stared at the stars and whispered his name. The real one, to the sky. No one remembered it, no one would record it, but he did, and sometimes that was enough. The quarry was endless. Day after day, he moved stone beneath the sun. No name, no history, just a pair of hands, a bent back, and a silence that made the overseers forget he'd once been anything else. But sometimes, the memories returned without invitation. When the air turned warm and thick, and the fig trees bloomed on the hills above the labor camp, he remembered the scent of oils, not the cheap kind used by servants. The fine-pressed perfumes, poured into alabaster flasks and rubbed into his skin by careful fingers. He remembered soft pillows, music, the brush of silk across his thighs, and then the whip cracked. The present came rushing back. The quarry didn't allow nostalgia. It didn't care what you once were. It only cared that you lifted stone, and lifted it again, until your bones screamed for mercy. His muscles grew. His posture changed. The boy he had been, delicate, trained for pleasure, was now a man carved by suffering. His hands bled daily. His back twisted with each rising sun. But even here, in this pit, the past followed. One evening, a merchant arrived with a caravan. His guards in fine bronze, his hair oiled and pinned like those old Athenian nobles. He watched the workers with disinterest until his gaze landed on one face. Recognition flickered. He called out a name, not his real one, not even his given slave name, but a pet name, like a collar, little one. The overseers laughed, but the merchant did not. He whispered something to the foreman. There was coin exchanged, and before he could resist, the man was pulled from the quarry and brought to a basin, washed, shaved, dressed in linen. It had been nearly a decade since he'd worn anything but rough wool, and he was being returned, not as a child, not as a delicacy, but as a novelty, an echo, something broken and reforged more for curiosity than lust. His new master didn't want obedience. He wanted stories. What did they do to you? The merchant asked, fingers trailing old scars. He didn't answer. What were you like back then? The merchant asked, dabbing wine on his lips. Still, silent. Can you still smile like you used to? And something inside him cracked. He did smile, not because he wanted to, but because it was the only thing he remembered how to do without pain. The house was full of men like him, older boys, former concubines, once glorious pleasures turned half-served. They didn't speak to each other. They just drifted like ghosts through the corridors. Some still wore makeup. Others stared at walls. At night, they were sometimes summoned, not for passion, for memory. Their masters treated them like books, opened for a story, then closed again. He hated them, not the men, the memories. They made him remember the lie of gentleness, the illusion of affection, crafted so carefully around control. The soft fingers that once made him feel special had only trained him to break on command. Now, he could see it all clearly. The rooms, the games, the songs they hummed to lull boys into obedience. He had been conditioned, not loved, and worse still, he had once believed it was the closest thing to love he would ever know. There was a boy in the house, no older than 10, pale, trembling, barely able to speak. The newest pet, dressed in gold, paraded at feasts, watched. The boy reminded him of himself. He tried not to care. Caring brought pain. Attachment brought weakness. He had learned that already. But one night, when he passed the boy's room and heard crying behind the door, he paused. His hand hovered over the handle, then lowered. What could he offer? Comfort. Advice. There was no language for what he'd survived. No warning that would mean anything until it was too late. So, he whispered 2 words under his breath. Remember this, and walked away. One night, the merchant hosted a private symposium. Only the wealthiest, the most twisted. He was dressed, oiled, painted. He stood beside his master like a relic, a broken statue polished for display. They called him the survivor. They asked about scars. They laughed when he refused to speak. Perhaps we should take his tongue, one joked, to make him more authentic. The laughter spread like mold, and as the room blurred, wine, smoke, memory. He saw it for what it was, a circle of men congratulating themselves on their cruelty. And him, complicit. Not by choice, but by inertia. The boy in gold was there too, pouring wine. smiling. That same smile. The one that said, "I know what I am now." That night he ran. He didn't know where he was going. Didn't care. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but he didn't stop. Because something in him, small, ancient, still alive, whispered, "Not again. Not another feast. Not another year pretending the pain had become normal." He reached the outskirts of the city by dawn, collapsed in a field, and for the first time in decades, he slept without being watched. When he woke, he kept walking. Through fields, over hills, into shadow. No plan, no coin, no name, only a memory of who he had been, and the flicker of who he might still become. He had no name to give, no papers, no citizen's mark, no past that anyone would believe or care to ask about. But the village needed hands, the olive groves needed tending, so they let him stay quietly, as long as he kept his head down and his mouth shut. He did both. He was older now, not old by age, but old in the eyes, in the way his body moved. Each scar spoke of another life, one he never spoke of. He worked from dawn until the sun dropped behind the stones. He drank water from his calloused hands, slept beneath the trees, and for a time, it was enough. There were no perfume, just dirt and wind and silence. That felt like mercy. He wasn't happy, but he was free, and that was something. They called him Xenostringer, not cruelly, just truthfully. He didn't speak of where he came from. When asked, he would say, "Only, I don't remember." But the truth was, he remembered everything. The weight of silks on his shoulders, the brush of cold bronze against his back, the breath of his first master against his neck, the scent of crushed figs, the metallic taste of blood. He remembered what it meant to be beautiful, and what it cost. One day, a young man from the village, a shepherd, quiet and kind, brought him bread and figs. He thanked him, but didn't speak more. The boy returned the next day, and the next. Eventually, words passed between them. Nothing personal, with the crops. A dead goat on the northern path. But each day, the boy stayed longer. He smiled the way no master ever had. Not possessive, not rehearsed, just present. It terrified him, because kindness was something he had never been trained to survive. Weeks passed. One night, the boy touched his shoulder, just gently, while sharing a fig, and something inside him, not in anger and panic. The touch had no intent, no demand, and yet it triggered everything. He pulled away, stood, walked into the dark. The boy didn't follow. He sat by a tree and wept, not because of the boy, not even because of fear, but because he realized how deep the damage went. Even safety felt dangerous now. Even softness felt like a lie. He avoided the boy for days, but the world is small when you have nowhere to go. They crossed paths again, by the stream, this time. The boy said nothing, just handed him a flask of water and kept walking. And that moment, that lack of expectation broke something open. He followed him back, sat by his fire, shared bread, spoke truly for the first time. Not about his past, but about the present, about birds. The way fig trees grow better in dry soil, the shape of clouds. It was the first real conversation he'd ever had, and it had nothing to do with obedience. Over time, something grew between them. Not romance, not passion, not at first, just trust. A kind of invisible thread tied not to bodies, but to silence. The kind of silence that felt safe, that didn't need filling. He still couldn't sleep indoors, still flinched when someone moved too quickly, still froze when touched unexpectedly. But he no longer had to explain. The boy, now a man, understood. Seasons passed, the trees changed, the hills grew gold, then green. Again, he learned to laugh. Not often, but enough. He began helping the villagers repair broken tools, fix fences, even teach the younger boys how to bind wounds and train animals. One child called him Uncle. He nearly cried, because it was the first name spoken to him that wasn't soaked in desire or command. It was a word of inclusion, of belonging. Still, the past haunted him. He dreamed of marble halls, of painted eyes, of cold wine dripping down his chest, of laughter that wasn't laughter. And in those dreams, he was always smiling. The smile of survival. The smile he had been taught, and had buried so deep, he forgot it wasn't his own. He would wake soaked in sweat, shaking, staring into the dark. But he was no longer alone. He didn't speak of it. He didn't have to. In the morning, they worked together as if nothing had happened. And that quiet acceptance was healing. One day, a caravan passed through the village. Among them, a nobleman from Athens. Old, fat, dripping in jewels. He didn't recognize him, but the nobleman recognized something. "You," he said. "I've seen you before, haven't I?" He said nothing. "Were you a flute player? A servant?" Still silence. The nobleman laughed. "No matter, you're older now. Not so lovely." He walked away, amused. But the moment lingered. That voice, that gaze, the past would always be there, whispering, but it no longer had power. He was not that boy anymore. He had outlived the man who bought him, the city that broke him, the name they gave him, and now he was simply himself. He died quietly. No feast, no ceremony, no marble tomb, just a body returned to the earth, wrapped in linen, buried beneath an olive tree, marked by a simple stone, and the hands of those who had grown to know him only in silence, only in truth. The villagers didn't know what he'd survived. They didn't need to. To them, he was the man who fixed hinges, mended fences, knew when the rains were coming just by smelling the wind. The man who never raised his voice, never turned away a hungry child, never asked for more than bread and peace. He had no titles, no statues, no myths, only peace. And that after everything was more than most kings ever found. But if you dig deep enough, you may find something, not in the temples, not in the scrolls, but in the whispers of old stones, in the myths that historians dismiss as poetic exaggerations. A song, perhaps, about a man with eyes like a wounded animal, who knew how to make silence feel sacred. A cautionary tale about a concubine who vanished one night, and was never seen again, though his name still lingered in the corners of certain houses, like perfume that refused to fade. Or maybe, nothing. Maybe his story was meant to be forgotten. That's how systems survive, by erasing the evidence. You see, the tragedy was never just that he was used, or broken. The tragedy is that his suffering was normalized, that he was trained to smile through it, that those around him, noblemen, poets, patrons, believed they were civilizing him, refining him, teaching him art, beauty, culture. But what they were really doing was teaching him to disappear, to fold in on himself so perfectly that no one would ever know he existed beyond their gaze. And yet, he did. In the end, his name was not carved in stone, but it lived in the hands he healed, the boy he warned, the soil he tended. And now, perhaps, in your mind, because you heard his story, and in a world that tried to erase him, that is rebellion. Dark Hour's archive is not about kings and battles. It's about the shadows behind the thrones, the quiet suffering beneath the marble, the truths buried beneath layers of myth and perfume. If this story moved you, if it made you see the past with new eyes, if you believe forgotten voices still deserve to be heard, then don't let this be the last story you hear. Subscribe to Dark Hour's archive, hit the bell icon, and join us as we uncover the side of history they hoped you'd never see. Because the past was never clean, never gentle, never quiet. It only pretended to be.